Greetings! In this video, I will tell you about the Battle of Poitiers, which took place in 732 between the army of the Arab Caliphate and the Frankish army. First, a little bit of background. In 711, the army of the Umayyad Caliphate invaded Spain. Over the next few years, the Visigothic kingdom was crushed, and the Muslims established their own state, Al-Andalus, on the territory of Spain. From 711 to 714, most of the Iberian Peninsula was conquered. The conquest of the Vandal kingdom was completed in 719, when the Muslims took Narbonne, the capital of the province of Septimania. After this, the Arabs set their sights on Gaul, and they had no intention of stopping. Previously, almost all of Gaul had been conquered by the Franks under the great king Clovis. However, after Clovis's death in 511, his kingdom fell apart. Gradually, the lands of the Franks were divided into three parts. Austrasia, located in the northeast of Gaul, which included the original lands of the Franks along the banks of the Rhine and Maas rivers. Neustria in the northwest, with its center in Paris, and Burgundy, in the east of the Frankish kingdom, in the territory of the former Burgundian state. To the southwest lay Aquitaine, which was considered a shared territory of all three Frankish rulers. Over time, the power of the kings diminished, and more authority was taken by the so-called major domus, meaning steward. The period of royal inactivity and de facto rule by the major domus is often referred to as the time of the lazy kings. Finally, in 687, the mayor of Austrasia, Pippin of Herstal, unified all three parts into one state. The position of mayor became hereditary, and Pippin took the title Dux et Princeps Francorum, leader and prince of the Franks. The role of the king became insignificant, as the monarch was entirely removed from political affairs. From 717, the state was ruled by Pippin's son, Charles, who earned the nickname Martel, the hammer, 717, 741. However, Duke Odo of Aquitaine, who did not recognize the authority of the mayors of the palace, took advantage of the internal strife in the Frankish kingdom and declared himself an independent ruler in 715, adopting the title Princeps Aquitanii. In 719, Charles Martel was forced to acknowledge the independence of Aquitaine. The Muslims began their invasion of Gaul immediately after their conquest of Spain, but due to internal conflicts, their expansion efforts were largely halted. Only in 730, after the appointment of Abd-ur-Rahman al-Ghafiqi as the ruler of Al-Andalus, did internal strife cease and the Muslims resumed their invasion. Aquitaine became the main target of the invasion, and its ruler, Duke Odo the Great, was, as you might guess, in conflict with Charles Martel. The Muslims hoped to defeat the Christian armies one by one. In 732, in the Battle of the Garonne River, Duke Odo was defeated, and the Duchy of Aquitaine was on the brink of disaster. Odo was forced to seek help from Charles Martel, who answered the call despite their mutual animosity. His primary concern was the Muslim invasion, and seizing the opportunity, he entered the war against the Muslims. I won't go into the details of the battles, but I will just say that the culmination of the fighting was the battle described here, which took place in October of 732. The Muslim and Christian armies met between the cities of Poitiers and Tours, near the border between the Frankish kingdom and Aquitaine. Therefore, the battle is known as the Battle of Poitiers, or the Battle of Tours. Now, let's look at the opposing armies. The Frankish army was formed as a militia of Free Franks. The entire army was divided into separate units led by royal ministers counts, and these units were further divided into hundreds. Thus, 100 effectively represented a group of relatives and neighbors fighting side by side. The core of the army consisted of seasoned warriors who had fought in many battles and, as a result, became true professionals. The overwhelming majority of the Frankish army was infantry. The national weapon of the Franks was the throwing axe with 1 or 2 blades. A rope was attached to the axe, and the Frank would skillfully throw it at the enemy at close range. For close combat, the Franks used swords. Frankish swords had a long and broad blade, slightly tapering toward the tip, with double-edged, straight edges. The blade length was typically between 70 and 80 centimeters. In the middle of the blade, along its entire length, there was a wide fuller, designed to lighten the weight of the weapon. To fight against infantry, the Franks had a short spear with barbed points on a long, sharp tip. The barbs of the spear pointed backward, making it very difficult to remove it from a wound. The warrior would first throw the spear, which would embed itself in the enemy's shield, and then step on the shaft, pulling the shield away before striking the opponent with his sword. The spear could not be pulled out because the barbs had pierced the shield. It could also not be cut off with a sword, as the shaft was covered in iron. To fight cavalry, the infantry were armed with long spears. The length of the spear shafts could reach up to 2 meters, with a thickness of 2.5 to 3.5 centimeters. The shafts were made from ash, willow, or poplar. The heavy iron tip was designed for both thrusting and cutting blows. The shields had a round, slightly convex shape and a diameter of around 80-90 centimeters. They were made from planks of alder, poplar, or oak. To give the shield its convex shape, the wooden planks were bent over steam, then joined at the edges in a way similar to how barrels are made today. The shield was gripped with a fist around a central handle that ran across the shield's face, giving it additional strength. The outer side of the handle was covered a metal shield boss, umbo. The shield was glued with cloth on the outside and around the edges, then covered with finely tanned sheep leather and brightly painted. The chainmail worn by the Franks took the form of a tunic with a hem reaching to the middle of the thigh and short sleeves up to the elbows. The mail was made from 20,000 to 25,000 rings with a diameter of 6 to 10 millimeters. The Franks wore simple iron helmets with a segmented construction. The helmet's dome was made from 2 or 4 parts, joined together by rivets. A faceplate for protection or a mail coif for the neck could be attached to the helmet. However, I should note that helmets and chainmail were rare. Only wealthy warriors and cavalry had them. The number of cavalry in the Frankish army was quite small, so the Frankish cavalry had little impact on the course of the battle. As for command, the Franks were well organized. The army was led by the outstanding general Charles Martel. Although the army included a separate detachment of Odo of Aquitaine's forces, overall command was unified. The size of the army ranged from 20,000 to 30,000 men. The Muslim army, by contrast, was primarily cavalry. It consisted of heavy Arab cavalry and light Berber horsemen. The weaponry of the Arab warriors was nothing particularly remarkable. A cavalry spear, a helmet, chainmail, a round shield, and a straight sword. Curved sabers appeared later. As for command, I consider Charles Martel a more significant general than Abdu or Rahman, but he was still a skilled and competent military leader. The size of the Muslim army is estimated by chroniclers to range from 20,000 to 80,000 men. Now let's move on to the battle itself. Both armies arrived at the future battlefield in early October 732. Charles Martel positioned his army on a steep hill, surrounded by trees, which undoubtedly made it difficult for the Muslim cavalry to maneuver. The Muslims positioned themselves on the flat plain at the foot of the hill. Both commanders faced the task of provoking the enemy into attacking first, as launching an attack themselves would play into the hands of the opponent. The Muslims were unwilling to attack uphill through trees, while the Franks had no intention of moving onto the plain. As a result, for 7 days the armies stood facing each other, waiting for the enemy to make the first move. However, early frosts were already setting in. The Franks, dressed in wolf and bear pelts, were well clad and didn't feel the cold, while the Arabs were dressed in light clothing more suited for North African winters than European ones. They were simply freezing, even though they had tents, which the Franks lacked. Moreover, each day of delay brought them closer to winter and the real cold, and finally Abd-ur-Rahman decided to begin the battle. Early on the morning of October 10th, the Arab cavalry attacked the Frankish positions. Charles Martel formed his men into a phalanx, and they performed the nearly impossible. The infantry withstood the charge of the Muslim cavalry. The Muslims repeated their attacks several times, and there were moments when the outcome hung in the balance, and Muslim warriors broke into the ranks. But all attacks were repelled. The turning point in the battle came when Charles sent a relatively small detachment of scouts to the Muslim camp. A rumor spread through the Arab ranks that the infidels were raiding their camp. It is worth noting that before reaching Poitiers, the Muslim army had traveled quite a long distance through Gaul and had already looted a considerable amount of wealth. The Arab warriors turned back toward their camp. This looked very much like a retreat, and the movement drew away a significant portion of the army. Abd-ur-Rahman, along with his detachment, was surrounded and killed in the battle. The Muslim army, left without its commander, retreated from the battlefield. Accounts of the casualties vary widely, but overall, all historians agree that the Muslim losses far exceeded those of the Frankish army. However, although the Muslim army suffered a crushing defeat, it was not annihilated, and the war continued in the following years, but no battles of such scale were fought again. I've called the Battle of Poitiers a turning point in European history. This is not an exaggeration. Had the Muslims defeated Charles Martel's army, there would have been no serious opponents left in Europe to stand against the invaders, and I believe European and world history would have been completely different. Additionally, as a result of the battle, Charles Martel was forced to carry out a reform that fundamentally changed the socio-economic landscape of Europe. The Battle of Poitiers showed that cavalry had come to dominate warfare, and it became urgent to develop this branch of the military. At Poitiers, the infantry managed to hold off the cavalry, but such luck couldn't last forever. The reason cavalry became the dominant force on the battlefield was the invention of the stirrup at the end of the 6th century. The stirrup was invented in China, but it was the Muslims who fully understood the significance of this innovation. Although in their early battles the Arabs won using infantry and cavalry without stirrups, they soon adopted the stirrup, and their armies became almost entirely cavalry. What changed with the invention of the stirrup? Before its introduction, cavalry could not charge at full gallop, because in such a case the rider would be immediately thrown from the saddle by the inertia of the lance strike. Cavalry tactics involved approaching the enemy's formation, with the rider standing still, using the spear to thrust into the enemy's ranks, hoping to disrupt the formation. At best, the cavalry would circle around the enemy's flanks and attack from behind, but even then, it was not at a full gallop, but at a light canter. However, with the stirrup, cavalry could charge in waves at full gallop, with the energy of the galloping horse adding tremendous force to the strike. Cavalry now swept away any infantry in their path, even well-organized ones. Thus, from the late 7th century onward, cavalry dominated the battlefield throughout most of the Middle Ages, until the rise of well-trained infantry armed with long pikes and halberds during the early modern era. However, heavy cavalry could not be formed based on a popular militia. In the Frankish army, warriors acquired their own weapons and equipment, which were not cheap. From the Lex Ripuaria, we know that a helmet cost 6 solidi, armor 12, a sword with scabbard 7, greaves 6, a spear, and shield 2, and a war horse 12, for a total of 45 solidi. To understand whether this was a lot or a little, here's another article from the same Lex Ripuaria. If anyone is to pay wergild for an ox, a horned, healthy, and sighted one, he should give 2 solidi. A horned, healthy, and sighted cow, 2 solidi. So, to equip oneself with weapons and armor, one would have to give away an entire herd of cattle. Only a large landowner could afford such an expense. Such was the situation among the Franks, and cavalry, though in small numbers, was present in the Frankish army. It was necessary to increase the number of cavalrymen. In this regard, Charles Martel implemented what is known as the Beneficiary Reform. Benefices were created, land holdings granted for life with the condition of providing military service. Each knight receiving this as a possession was required to appear in the royal army on a trained horse, armed and equipped with protective gear, including armor, a spear, and a sword. Thanks to this, the army of the Frankish kingdom gradually became predominantly cavalry. A description of the appearance of a Frankish warrior during the Carolingian era can be found in a 773 account written by a monk from the Abbey of St. Gaul. The king wore an iron helmet with a crest, iron mail gauntlets on his arms. His thighs were covered in chainmail, and his legs were protected by iron greaves. In his left hand he held an iron spear, and in his right a sword. The king's shield was entirely made of iron, without any patterns or coats of arms. The king's warriors were equipped more lightly to make it easier for them to mount their horses. With that, I conclude my story. Goodbye.